welcome back to week 5. This week we're talking about rule number 5. Rule number 5 being don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. I feel like this is one of those topics that is obviously more difficult for either of us to comprehend just because we're both men and we both
Not parents.
are not parents. But on some level I feel as though understanding like the things that our parents went through, and then just putting ourselves in their shoes, and then just I'm sure we both have friends that are parents right now too, and have to go through the difficult process of like raising and disciplining and teaching their children about just life and stuff. Like I feel like we sort of live vicariously through other people's experiences, and to a certain extent we can kind of understand the circumstances of this rule.
I was also too, as I read it, I was kind of like trying to be like, well, I just don't want to sit here all the whole time and talk about like hypotheticals or like, oh, I'll try and do this when I'm a dad someday if I ever have kids, but more like try and see what in this chapter is applicable to just like everyday life, even if you don't have kids as well, you know?
Yeah, so I mean, like, what did you find? Or like what did you sort of, how deep do you have to dig to get to that point?
I feel like it wasn't too hard. It was a lot of just like, okay, here's like a concept and here's how I would apply it. So like one of the first things I was thinking of was there's that little section where he talks about getting like resentful, and you can be like a really terrible person if you're just like angry. And I was like, oh yeah, like displacing my anger onto someone else is like really shitty and really sucks to do. And I've seen that like if you're in a work environment and you just like don't deal with either people you're in charge of or like bringing up an issue with someone who's over you, how quickly you get like really resentful towards that person, and it just kind of ruins the whole workplace environment. Even if like people don't realize it, you just start to like really hate going to work with certain people because you just haven't addressed an issue, or you haven't properly dealt with
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't know, insubordination seems like a strong word, but that's the one that's popping in my head.
Mm.
But like if you have to deal with like, for example, I was like a pool manager for a while, and if I hadn't dealt with the lifeguards that were under me like in the correct way, like it could become like a really crappy environment to deal with.
Yeah, I think if you were just to look at it from the perspective of just leadership in general, like if you ever
Mm,
had any sort of authority over other human beings, I think it becomes pretty clear where you have to start drawing lines in the sand and establishing like what when no means no, and also exactly what no means when you say it.
yeah.
And I think that's something that's definitely something he talks about, especially towards like the later parts of the chapter. And I think that's the core of. I think because I'm sure he didn't necessarily just write this chapter bearing in mind that either everyone's a parent or everyone is going to be a parent. So
Yeah.
I like to think that he made this like accessible to everyone. So for me, the heart of the chapter isn't even just um, how to raise your kids, but it's like when does no mean no, and also what exactly does it
Yeah.
mean. I think
Because
in the unique instance where you are a parent, and like it's like with particularly unruly children. I think I think that's probably the only time where I think like a like physical discipline, like spanking or whatever. Like I don't know if you were raised and you were like ever spanked, but
yeah.
I mean obviously it's not fun, but it's also like you
No.
look back at it and it's like you recognize that it wasn't cruel, and
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
recognize it wasn't malicious, or um, they weren't trying to hurt you. It's like you do something and then the immediate feedback is, oh, I get spanked, and it's like, oh, I don't want to do that again.
Yeah.
you know and that's what no means when you're.
Yeah.
And he says like when like civilized adults say no to each other, there's like the protection of law.
Yeah.
um and also just societal expectation. It's like a large man can't just like smack a tiny woman for like her like violating, like, well, I guess it's kind of weird to say, but like when he says no, that's not exactly like what the logical conclusion of no means, right? Because
Yeah.
it's just not the same. But like when it's a kid that literally doesn't know any better, and you need an immediate like feedback, like that's what it comes down to.
Yeah. Well, I think if you like expand that to like adult life, you know, when like a larger man says no to a woman in the workplace, like obviously 99% of the time he's probably not actually threatening her with physical force. It's more
Right.
like, I'm your boss, I just said no. If you don't like follow the rules of the office, I mean, that would go for anyone in the office. Like, you're not threatening them with violence. It's more like, oh, if you don't follow the rules of the office or the job, you're gonna get fired, which is like the next step.
Yeah. It's like
Which,
and he says it in like more vague terms too, where it's like
yeah,
if you don't if you continue with what you're doing, something you don't like will happen.
yeah. I think because I thought when I was reading that, I thought about like I saw some interesting debates a little while back where people were discussing like, is physical force necessary to protect property rights? You know, there's like, you know, like online like super far left people who are like basically socialist slash communist types, and I'd see them debate, and they're like, oh, there's like no excuse to threaten someone else's life for property. But then the guy who was like supporting this was like, well, if you don't have any physical force behind that, then what stops someone from just like continually stealing from you, you know?
Right.
So like all of society is kind of based, like, we don't want to admit it, but like there has to be some underlying force behind it, or else none of the rules will eventually work, because like people like to think that people are inherently good, and I think he gets into that a little bit in the middle there about like the blank slate, and like how there was the noble savage idea that man used to be good but he's been corrupted by society, whereas like more like society's threat of force from I like the metaphor of the government as a shackled leviathan. Like, it can come and there is force if you don't follow societal rules. And
Right.
then, you know, obviously we can always discuss like where those lines are drawn, but like if we didn't have some threat of physical force in society, society would be a lot worse off. And then, you know, he's obviously talking about kids, where you say no to your kid, there's like a underlying threat in quotes
Right.
force behind your words, that you're like, okay, well, if you don't listen now to my no, the next step is this, and then, you know, it's just gets worse from there.
Mm. Yeah, I think anyone who chooses to deny the fact that anyone who chooses to deny the fact that if you continue to like violate other people's rights, or um if you refuse to like acknowledge no as an answer, like they haven't been living in reality, you know? To recognize that like violence isn't like the ultimate conclusion to like a situation like that, you know?
Yeah.
It's like you look at any sort of like domestic dispute or something. Um, you know, I feel like you wouldn't even have to look that hard just in terms of the types of people, or even like the types of families where like I'm not saying it's right, but like where like physical violence erupts, or even just like arguments with your friends too. And I mean, like you and I both as like men, and we both grew up in like the Midwest, right? Like like people back there are pretty rough, and they can be pretty
Yeah.
rowdy, and you know you especially among boys, like the whole idea of rough and tumble play is very common, to the point where I feel
Yeah.
as though like not only number one is it necessary to sort of for us to like gauge between ourselves like what are like the limits of our physical capacity, and also ultimately realizing, oh, there's a better way to like solve a lot of issues rather than just beating the shit out of each other.
Yeah.
But it's also like I don't know. It's also like developing like a certain level of respect too, because it's like, oh,
Yeah.
you can't just get away with pushing people around and expecting to get away with it whatever you want. You know, it's like there are going to be consequences, um,
Yeah.
and a lot of times, like if you push it far enough, like it'll be violent. Um, and
Yeah.
I
Well,
feel as though like people that refuse to deny it either have just lived incredibly like fortunate lives, or they're just so in their heads and they're so ignorant of like reality, or like they haven't lived in enough places that aren't like gated communities.
yeah, the Sleeping Beauty who hasn't touched the spinning wheel yet, like he goes into.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's why he does that because I'd made note, like I actually made notes this week, so I felt a little more on top of it. But I made like my last note is just his like five kind of rules that he set out, and I think number two, that's why he said like there is always this underlying force, but you always need to use the minimum necessary
Mm,
force
yeah.
to start. So, it's like, oh, if you are, stealing from the store, like the minimum necessary force is the police being like, all right, well, I'm going to stop you and you get in the car and we do like, we book you and then you get like whatever, a small sentence. But if you keep escalating, that minimum necessary force will start increasing. So if you run away from the cop, well, he's going to chase you and tackle you and then like be a little rougher with you. If you keep resisting arrest, well, you're probably going to get put into some even more uncomfortable position. And if you're really resisting, like fighting back, obviously at some point it's going to escalate to like fighting you and then to deadly force if necessary.
Yeah, I think about this a lot too. It's kind of weird because I mean, whenever you're talking about almost sort of like a street fight, it's like it's the idea of bringing a knife to a gunfight. But then as soon as
Mm,
you do that, like someone like brings like five other people with guns. And then
yeah.
suddenly like someone else brings like a bunch of cars, and then they get like a semi-automatic or automatic weapons or something. And now you have a full-blown turf war. It's like the escalation like will continue ad nauseum, and there's no end to it. So I feel as though that's probably the most important. That's probably the most important like stipulation that he puts into this chapter, where it's like,
Yeah.
hey, even though there are times when we're justified in terms of um, using necessary force, we can't like let ourselves get carried away here. And
Yeah.
the other thing with that too, I feel it also comes with this underlying sense of it can't it can't be emotionally charged, like
Yeah.
the retribution or the punishment, like because the second you do, it's like your emotions just get out of hand, and now suddenly it's like you're saying like crazy things, and you're like hitting people way harder than what is absolutely necessary. And I'm not even saying like it's necessary to hit people. I'm just saying that like
Yeah. Yeah.
you just get
Y-
you just get like possessed by like the spirit of vengeance.
yeah. You're giving life sentences for stealing chocolate bars from
Yeah,
the
no
C
kidding.
store.
And I mean, I feel like uh, this is year 2021, almost a little over a year ago too. We saw that same thing happen with like George Floyd. I think he used a fake bill or something to buy, what was it, cigarettes or something?
Yeah. I don't.
Or
Yeah.
he
I
was
just
trying to
remember
sell.
using
I
counterfeit.
can't remember the
Yeah.
details, but yeah, I mean, everyone's seen the video now at this point of the cop like kneeling on his neck, and he's
Yeah.
already like in restraints, and I'm pretty sure like I'm pretty sure there's like a bone in everyone's body. Everyone who has like at least some ounce of sympathy, where it's like, did he really need to do that?
Yeah. Yeah. Even
Regardless
if
of
it
what
was like,
regardless of what your thoughts of like George Floyd and his like character or his history. Um,
yeah, like was it, especially after like a couple minutes where he's obviously like no longer
oh yeah.
strongly resisting, like maybe for a brief moment you need that like, hey, stop it. I need to like over apply for a moment.
Hmm.
But I think, yeah, we keep circling that whole idea of like the tricky dichotomy of not being not under punishing, but also not over punishing, because he went into that a little bit where he was like, oh, you can't make like punishment seem random. It always needs to be strictly enforced and also consistent with the crime, which I think I've seen this before when I was trying to figure out, I taught swimming lessons forever. And you could really tell, like, oh, if you don't like draw solid lines right away, it's really hard to corral kids back into line. And you even feel like being a little bit of a tyrant at the end of the day, where you're just like, all right, well, we're not getting anything done, so we're just gonna sit here and do like be very, very strict because you guys.
Yeah.
But then sometimes I reflect back on it and realize, oh, the reason why it got so out of hand is not because the kids were particularly rowdy. Sometimes that happens, but it was, oh, I wasn't setting strict guidelines or boundaries and strict, like, I shouldn't say strict punishments, but like exact punishment for being like, oh, if you, jumped in the pool when I wasn't there and I said not to, I didn't like immediately give a exact punishment back. So then that it just kept getting out of control that way.
Yeah, he sort of along a similar vein. He also talks about this too in terms of young children being able to create their own personality or be more creative. He's like the core or the way that creativity is actually spawned is when you implement like very strict rigid rules first, like initially, and then from there it's like the people understand like I think a lot of people I've heard this being thrown around a lot more recently where it's the idea of for you to be able to break the rules you have to know them to like a T, but
Yeah.
that also implies like the necessity of like the existence of the rules to begin with before you start breaking them, you know. And it's like it's always good to start with like a reasonable amount of like strict order because at a certain point, you know, there are expectations that are necessary for like society to function and also just for things to get done in general, right? And it's like
Yeah.
the rules don't exist to like exist for forever. You know, sometimes they exist because that's the extent of our knowledge at the time, and then we lax up on them or we change the rules later such that it enables more freedom or it enables more creativity. But that doesn't abolish like the need of the rule. It doesn't abolish the necessity of the rule to begin with, you know. It's like we don't throw
Yeah.
out the baby with the bathwater. And it's pretty cool to see that you were able to recognize that in like like when you were working with kids too. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah. And I think too, I don't, this is a little bit kind of tangential, but it's like, I feel like I was sitting there when I read that whole creativity thing where it's like, oh yeah, if you have like rules around you, I think people do a lot better because I was thinking how sometimes, in like high school English, your teacher would just be like, okay, write a 10-page paper on anything you want. And you immediately have so much freedom that you're just like, I have no idea what to write about. I have like nothing
Yeah.
like what the heck?
That's
And
actually a
then
great
I
way
was like,
of putting it, yeah.
yeah.
I
But
th-
then when your teacher's like, okay, you need to write a 10-page paper on a topic from the Civil War, you go, okay, well, here's the Civil War. What's something I find interesting? Oh, it's this topic. And then they're like, oh, and it has to be a persuasive essay. So you're like, okay, well, that eliminates so many topics I can't just talk about. I need to like convince you of something. Okay, well, here's, you start getting like really rigid and then you start coming up with creative ways to like solve the problem of your assignment.
yeah, it's the same thing too as something you run into when you're in like a job interview and someone's like tell us about yourself. And it's like
Yeah.
that's not very helpful. It's like what do you want to well what do you want to know? You know, so there's never a right answer, and it's kind of in my opinion, it speaks more towards the laziness of the interviewer. But I also think
Yeah.
if you're able to answer like effectively and answer effectively and tastefully, I feel like it speaks to it actually almost feels as though like you don't need that job, you know, because it's like
Yeah.
what is
Yeah.
there left for you to learn if your mentors are just going to be lazy as fuck when they ask you these questions. Yeah, but it is interesting like that because sometimes I feel as though whenever you're talking to people, like the most natural way to start a conversation is to ask like an open-ended question, right?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily like a yes or no type thing, but like you want to start with like an open-ended question, and if people are having difficulty with that, you want to like slowly like put up like the bumpers, like like when you're bowling, put up like the bowling bumpers or something, just to enable like a more smooth transition of conversation. But I
Yeah.
feel as though sometimes you have to dance between that border of like both order and chaos, just in terms of
Yeah.
regulation of a conversation for anything to get done. But also keep it interesting enough for you to want to perpetuate the conversation. Because if you're just doing
Yeah.
things like yes or like so orderly to the point where the only options are yes or no, it's like why the hell would I even want to talk to you? You know?
Which I think you can start imposing your own restrictions to get more creative too. When I was just thinking, when you apply to like med school or like when you apply to college, there's always that stupid question that everyone hates that's just like, why do you want to be a doctor? Like, what would make you great in college or whatever it is? And you immediately have to think, okay, well, I can't just say anything, so I have to restrict it to something that makes sense. But then also, I can't sound like every other one. So you start like kind of creating your own meta restrictions around it where it's like, okay, they didn't say I can't write about this, but everyone's going to say I want to help people. So I need to either think of a creative way to say that sounds unique, or I need to think of something else. And like you can't just say, oh, it's also a good paying job and I get to help people. So because then the next one's like, oh, you want to help people, why didn't you pick nursing? So you start making your own restrictions to get more creative with your answers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, I always like thinking of telling like a story in the sense that I don't have to tell you exactly what the thesis is. I want to give you like
Mm,
enough. I want to give you enough breadcrumbs to the point where you know exactly what the logical conclusion is. You know, and I
yeah.
feel as though, especially when it comes to writing, this is probably going to bore people because this is like writing isn't exactly the most interesting thing. But at any rate, I feel as though the most boring types of things to read are the things that where it's like I believe in this. Uh, I think I believe in this because of X, Y, and Z, and then ultimately, like, here is my conclusion. Like for me, that's so boring and like so uninteresting too, and that's like another one of those instances where like it's like someone just took a rubric and then just like copied and pasted like things that fulfilled the criteria or
Yeah.
whatever for each one of those things. Um, and it there's like no creative there's no like creative expression too. And I think for me, like if I were to like sort of reflect on myself and think about like the kind of parent that I want to be, sort of like more geared towards the obvious connection of this chapter. It's like I remember the things that I like my parents forced me to do. I don't know how much like aside from like just regular schooling and not being a shit human being your parents force you to do, but I used to have to like take piano lessons, and
Yeah.
I had to fight for like my right to even just play sports like with my
Hmm.
family, but like I feel as though I'd probably take that same approach with my family, but that my parents took with me, but like force them to do more shit, because I
Yeah.
mean even still like I was finding ways of getting into trouble, um, and the crazy thing is that like my parents never knew about it. Like somehow they kept no one told me about like the trouble that I was getting into. So like at home they always thought I was like a
Mm.
good kid. But like secretly at school I was like acting out or something because like I wanted attention or whatever, and I was just hanging out with the wrong people, putting myself in dangerous ways and shit. But I'd probably do more things to like be more strict too, and then I think as like my kids would approach like the age of adulthood, I would probably just be more and more like lenient and actually give them like that absolute freedom before they even hit 18 too.
Yeah.
Because I feel as though
Which
there's a difference between like absolute freedom and then absolute freedom but someone else is still responsible for you.
yeah, like almost training wheels for being an adult, but
Yeah, I think so.
yeah.
When
Which I think I kind of liked the way my parents did it cuz yeah, they were pretty strict, I did all the piano lessons and stuff too growing up, but then I think they were slowly got less strict in high school, which I kind of liked cuz they were at first like, okay, freshman year you have to do like everything that's like offered. So, I was like, oh, so I have to play soccer, basketball, and track. But then they were like, oh, I really don't like basketball. So they're like, okay, well, as long as you're doing something during the winter months, you don't have to play basketball. So then during winter months, I focused a lot more on other things, like band or choir. Or we had like, we had a floor hockey league that I joined, which was just like fun, but they were still like, as long as you're doing something. And then, later on, I worked a crazy ton during the winter months because I just had that free time. But I think something like that where you're strict going into it and then you start being more lenient, but also giving that little bit of freedom where it's like, okay, well, you can't do nothing, but you don't have to do a specific thing. So it's like you can pick from, you know?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good approach because it still lets your kid. Because I mean, what if your kid just absolutely hates swimming? You know,
Yeah.
it's like I think that's actually one of those instances where like, especially increased order. It's not like necessarily you letting them doing things that like make you dislike them. It's like the other way around, where it's like if you push a little too far, they start to hate you, and they start
Yeah.
to hate you, but for like it feels weird to say, but I can't think of a better way to say it. But like they start hating you for the wrong reasons. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
like you'll say you'll hate your parents or something. And it's like, oh, I hate you. Like if they don't let you do something like stupid or trivial or whatever. But if you're like making their life a living hell, you know, where it's like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm getting bullied at school like all the time because like um, I'm just like in swimming class. I'm on the swim team or something, and I'm just no good at it. I'm still gonna make you do
Yeah.
swimming and stuff, even though you hate it, and then everyone hates you. It's like I'm probably gonna hate you too, you know.
Yeah.
Is there
But
anything?
then, yeah.
Yeah, is there anything like your parents did that like made you hate them, or like it made your relationship with them like more contentious or whatever?
I think growing up with my dad, he was definitely a lot more of that. Here's the rules and you'll follow them because I said so kind of
Hmm.
parenting figure, which I hope to kind of learn from. I mean, we're pretty good. We're on pretty good terms now, but definitely in like high school, it was a lot of that like, and I don't think that was really touched on this chapter, but you know that whole you have to do this right now because I said so, and there's not a lot of which I've definitely learned from listening to a lot of people being like, "Oh, you need to like give your kids a reason why you have a rule or reason why you're making them do something in like a specific way or else they will kind of resent you," which I think I did. You know, everyone goes through that teenage phase, but like I think it really was more against my dad than my mom because he was a lot more of that, you know, you're gonna do your chores right now because I said
Yeah.
so. When I'm like, oh, like I can do them later. My friends are like free to hang out now, so you're not giving me like a reason to, which I would hope to get in the future is always to come up with a reason to get someone, you know, on board with whatever rule. Which I think I've heard like Jocko talk about it, where in like the business place, it's like you have to get your like organization and like the people on the ground floor in on the mission of the thing before you can like enforce any rules against them. So the same with like parenting. You have to like convince your kid why why these rules are in place, even if it's like a long term thing where you know you have to practice your piano 30 minutes a day and the kid might be saying I hate playing the piano. Why do I have to play piano every day? I want to play today. Where it's even if you're not going to be playing piano forever, it's a good habit to get into to get a little bit of discipline into your life to practice every day. If that makes sense.
Yeah, there's actually a significant portion of this chapter. I think it's like probably an entire paragraph. I can't find it. I probably should put a mark on it. But he was like giving off a
Yeah.
bunch of rules for like
Yeah.
just general behavior, and then at the end of each rule, he gives like a short explanation for why, you know.
Yeah.
And then obviously the annoying counterpart of that is like where you explain something and then your kid's just being an annoying piece of shit, and they're just like, oh, why is this? And they just keep asking why, but like not for any particular reason, but just to be annoying, you know. But I feel
Yeah.
as though as long as you're able to supplement your rules with like a certain amount of reason too, and sort of bearing in mind that there's not like any sort of cognitive delay or like cognitive development issues. I feel
Yeah.
as though like the longer you enforce them, it's like sometimes you stare at a table long enough or something, and it's like, oh, this is why there are four legs instead of two, or you also start to think to yourself too, where it's like, oh, this is why like a stool with three legs is never like unsteady versus like a chair that's got four legs is sometimes crooked or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sometimes you
Yeah.
you you see the thing long enough to the point to where you find out why it exists in the first place, and then you start to pick out like the imperfections and where you're able to like push the boundaries of your understanding for that certain thing. I think
Yeah.
another thing too that I think is like really contentious of this chapter, and I think he actually is a little he's a little like self aware of this, of the nature of this statement too. But it's the third rule that he has for like disciplinary principles, where it's like parents should come in pairs. I feel as though
Mm.
like this is one of those things where I feel as though people kind of take his words and like twist them out of context, because it's not like he's saying like, oh, we should just shit on single mothers,
Yeah.
and then just put them down and then just like completely disparage or like invalidate like their experiences or like their worth. But he is right, um, or at least in my opinion he is right, where it's like
Yeah.
parents should come in pairs. Because I mean, like, I don't know if you've ever had to babysit kids, but especially if you're babysitting more than one kid, like,
Yeah.
and you're alone, it's a lot. Like, like, not only that too. It's like when when I was babysitting, I didn't have to like also go out of my way to like make money to put food on the table too. You know, there's only so much
Mm.
responsibility that one person can have for another human being. It's like at some point you have to start sharing the load. I don't know what your thoughts of that are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm pretty sure it's like one of those things that's like actually statistically shown where it's like, oh, kids raised in single parent households are more likely to like not do as well in school or become incarcerated, stuff like that. So like the stats kind of play out. And shoot, I had like two thoughts on this where I think a lot of times it gets into like this meta conversation when people are talking about this, where it's like, oh, well, some people on the right, which rightly do, put way too much pressure on your individual decisions and not thinking about like, oh, shit sometimes happens and we have to like think of a way to deal with what to do with single parents, you know? So there is a point there to be made, but then when someone says like, well, it's better to have two parents, they think they immediately jump to this meta conversation about like, oh, you're saying that single mothers are irresponsible for having kids out of wedlock, and they go down that big rabbit hole, which is a whole conversation on itself, having meta conversations. Dang it, I just had it on the tip of my tongue and then vanished again.
Yeah, I think.
My second point.
Yeah, I guess I'll try to like fill in the gaps for you too while you try and parse that part out. But in my opinion, it's like looking at 43 and like the numbers 43 and 47, and then just like this saying that's the same as like the difference between 4 and 0. You know, it's like while the math is still
Mm,
like equivalent, they're not the same like absolute values. You know, it's not to say that one is objectively valued at 0 and the other one is like infinitely greater. It's like no,
yeah,
there's certain instances or certain interpretations or certain facts or, where one is the experience of one is significantly like improved under these circumstances, and then in this
yeah,
circumstance it would be, oh, if we had a double parent household. And I feel as though like the next logical step for like a person that's trying to rebuke, I guess, the argument is to say, oh well, what if the parents don't get along, or it's like an abusive household? And it's like we're not being foolish here,
yeah,
in
yeah,
terms of like just dismissing like unique experiences, but objectively. And I think also like the pressure from society to a certain degree that keeps people like together in marriage is sometimes like also the pressure that people need to stay together too, because like a
yeah,
lot of times love isn't enough to uh, maintain marriages, right? Like a lot of it's
yeah,
also the commitment and
yeah,
also like the promises that you made to each other and also to like the family that you create too. You know,
yeah,
sometimes people forget that, and sometimes like the pressure is what you need, um, to
yeah.
stay
And I
together.
think sometimes people they'll find that exception to the rule and be like, "See, we just we just disproved it." But I think I heard someone say a while ago, like people have a really tough time dealing with averages and thinking in like large scale.
Mm,
So when someone says, "Oh, it's better to have two parents in the household to raise a child," they immediately think of like the case down the street where there's a terrible abusive family and the dad's always coming home drunk and the mom's having an issue, and he's like, oh well, what about those two parents? Where the the exception kind of proves the rule, but there we have to also deal with those exceptions, and where you come into that modifying the rule. You know, you need to limit the number of rules, but then when an exception shows up, you'll have like a little caveat where it says, you know, two parents are good, but if the two parents together are terrible for the children, we need to do something about that situation, whether it's remove the child and give them to a better two parent household, or if it's a single parent, you know, we have to find a way to supplement that single parent. And maybe that's through private charity or through like government programs, or, you know, family needs to step in and be that surrogate second parent, whatever it is, you know?
Yeah, I think I think in another thing too, to sort of build off of that idea also is that when we talk about people, like we try to talk about like whenever we're talking about like obtaining results or like pushing progress forward. Typically, that comes with like uh, the implied factor of consistency, you know. And I mean, any human being that's ever lived for greater than like I feel like even just 10 years knows like very clearly that consistency is like hard as fuck, you know.
Yeah.
So like a lot of times too when people are like, oh, this is one thing I mean I respect Ben Shapiro and a lot of his opinions. I think a lot of them make sense. But one of the things that like kind of ticks me off about it, about like one of his theories about like education and stuff, and also like the idea of privatized education too, is like he'll say like, oh, just get a voucher or something for like a school in a different district if your school isn't up to snuff or whatever. And it's like, number one, not all people know about that, right?
Yeah.
And also number two, it's like even if they do get a voucher, it's like how much farther out of your way do you have to go to like put them into those instances? Mm-hmm. And not only that too, how can you like maintain that consistently?
Yeah.
And also how easily is that to like replicate across multiple families across different like sort of life situations too? I feel like especially with when it comes to just larger scale things, just because we're talking about like the idea of averages, it's just so hard to contextualize everything because like I mean I feel like that asshole who has to say, oh, not all families are the same, but you know it's like that really is true, you know, and you can't control for like all the variables and all the factors. Sometimes like it's like I get it. We try to have resources in place for people that like fall through the cracks, but at the same time it's like it's not that simple, you know.
Yeah. I did remember though the second thing was, I think it's another sort of meta conversation around this, and I think sometimes people are afraid to admit what the truth is about a situation because of what it may imply. So if you think about this scenario where we say that two parents are typically better for to raise a child, that, you know, what does that imply about kids who are raised under single parents? Does that mean they're destined to fail? Or what does that say about, like, if a certain group of people have a disproportionate number of single parents, what does that say about them? And, you know, they'll go down this rabbit hole being afraid. It's like, oh well, there's a disproportionate amount of single parents in, say, the black community. I don't know if that's true or not, but then, you know, racist people, far right racist people, are going to use that and say, see, they're like inferior or whatever. So I think sometimes people are afraid to just say that truth, because I like to come and find whatever that truth is. So say that two parents is the best way to raise a child. Okay, so we have this fact. It's not being descriptive. So what's the prescriptive measure? Oh, it's to go to single parents and, like I said earlier, somehow supplement that single parent, either, you know, financially or through some sort of surrogate parental figure to help them out, something like that, which doesn't always have to be state run. But I think societally, if we can find a fact like that, even if it's uncomfortable to come up with said fact, we can find a better solution instead of ignoring the fact because we're afraid it might imply something that we don't want it to imply.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And from like a medical perspective, sort of the parallel Sort of a scenario that I sort of see in the thing that you brought up is like like the reason why HIPAA exists, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like HIPAA exists so that people feel comfortable enough to be able to share like their most like intimate things like pertaining to not just like their medical history but also like their personal history too, because it gives us the best possible picture of understanding what the hell's going on in someone's life, without number one judgment and also without the fear of them receiving like some sort of legal or even social retribution for like the experiences that they've had too. And it's like if that didn't exist, then there's probably like so many, especially like sexually transmitted diseases or stuff like that. I feel that would just go under the radar, or that would just like result in like such worse health outcomes too, just because
Mm-hmm.
people were afraid of like the perception of being able to bring to light the fact that like they were sexually active and with multiple partners and they were unfaithful to like their wife or husband or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And now it's like now that becomes like a public health issue, and I feel as though when
Yeah.
you I think another thing too is that also the idea of when people say when they want to take like the stigma away of talking about a conversation, I actually feel as though that's the wrong way to. I think that's the wrong approach uh, to that sort of argument, to that sort of problem,
Mm-hmm.
because I feel as though like it implies the meaning that like the only possible way to have a rational conversation about any contentious issue is to like destigmatize it first, and it's like
Yeah. Yeah.
you have to be able to have a conversation about it first off before like it's even like entered the realm of being destigmatized or whatever, you know. So I feel as though and I don't know, this is still like a half-baked idea too. It almost feels kind of lazy too on behalf of some people, where it's like, oh, I don't have to get my ducks in order until someone else figures out a more effective way to like communicate this idea, you know.
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh, I wait until this becomes like a more politically correct topic to talk about before I actually express my feelings on it, you know. Just because
Yeah.
it's not like it's not PC. I risk like a bunch of things. I risk like my social standing or my social perception or even my job too, you know, right? But and those are all fair things to be worried about as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but also it's like that same thing too, within like that meta narrative where it's like let's be honest here in terms of why we're not talking about certain things, or we're talking about them because it's like not
Yeah.
PC, or is it um, or is it because like
It,
they're not, it's not the reality of the situation.
yeah. Or it's so outside the realm of like, you know, it's annoying that we still have to talk about like flat earthers in modern day society, but
Right.
you know, if we use a non politically contentious example, it's like, oh, like flat Earth should be so outside the realm of possibility for like 99.9999% of people. We don't even have to discuss it because we had that contentious conversation with whoever discovered that the Earth was round. You know, Leon or not Leon, Galileo, whoever the hell
Isn't it
I can't
Magellan?
remember who
I think Galileo
was it.
did the.
Magellan.
I think so because he did the.
Galileo was the sun.
Yeah, he did the sun.
Yeah, whatever it is. But you know, because we had that conversation centuries ago. Now it's so far out of the realm of possibility that we don't even have to discuss it. So hopefully, some of these more contentious things we're talking about today, someday will be so far outside the realm of possibility that because we've dealt with it today, so it's not just sitting around here festering. And I think too, I was gonna say along this topic of discussing contentious topics, I really don't like ceding it to people who are willing to discuss this topic, because then we get in the risk of people who you may not want discuss. I shouldn't say not want discussing, obviously freedom of speech, whatever, but you may have people who come to conclusions that you don't want to become the conclusions discussing it, and then you start running the risk of those becoming the only solutions that are being propagated because those are the only people being allowed to discuss these issues. Or you may have very poorly informed people discussing issues, and you just get afraid of running the risk of, again, coming to the wrong conclusions or the wrong solutions because only certain people are willing to discuss this topic because it is contentious.
Right, because it's like it sounds like what you're saying is the the system that enables like certain personalities to talk about particularly contentious topics. It's like the loudest voices arise to the top, but also like within that structure, it's like what type of personality traits enable people to play that game effectively to the point where they do become like the loudest, not only the loudest in the room, but also what sort of opinions do they have, and how would it disproportionately affect like the population as a whole based on like whatever political ideologies or leanings that they have.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting though. I feel like that's also a thing that's clearly a thing when for me the most obvious representation of that is like mainstream media.
Yeah.
But also just sort of like on the level of just like day-to-day life too. Like whenever I open, I'm off social media now, but like whenever I did open social media way back when, it was always like the same people occupying my feed, you know? And at a certain point, it's like people just started living their own lives and they stopped caring about those things too. But it's also like, that's also a problem in some ways too, because society doesn't just live without you tending to it, right? There's a certain I'm not saying you have to like participate on social media to like take action, or like to voice like your incredibly meaningful and profound opinions, no matter how like significant they may seem. It's like you still have to attend to like the issues that are facing like everyday people. Otherwise, you not only like fall out of touch with people, but you also like lose the ability to communicate in those realms. You forget what it's like to like talk with people that don't agree with all of the opinions that you have, you know?
Yeah.
I thought I would actually disagree with this chapter more. I'm not gonna lie. When I first started reading this, because it's like if you were just to read the rule like for what it is without reading the chapter at all, you'd be like, that seems kind of cruel. It's like, what are the odds that your kids are actually gonna do something that you don't like?
Yeah.
And it's like, that's true, but it's also like it's important to distinguish between the lines of are you letting them do things that you don't like, or are you letting them do things that will ultimately make you dislike them, you know? I feel like there's a very small boundary in between those two, and I like how he also talks about the idea that you're not supposed to be like your child's friend, you know? You're supposed to be like that buffer between like nascent infant life to like integrating into society.
Yeah. I think, because I was immediately a thought of Mean Girls.
Like with Lindsay Lohan.
Yeah, where I thought that's just a typical example where you're watching a movie or a show where the parent or parental figure is trying to be a friend or being so cool, and it's almost always to the character who you don't want to be like in that show. So like in Mean Girls, I think her name is Regina George. Like she's a terrible person in school, and then you see her home life and her mom's like trying to be the cool mom, and it's like, do you want wine or whatever? And I think I've seen that a lot in media, and I think oftentimes in media we get these cliches or themes that run a lot because it is kind of true, and it's meta, it's true enough, as Jordan Peterson would say, or meta true, or whatever, however you would describe it, where yes, if you are trying to be friends with your child, you're not always going to be able to properly enforce certain rules with them, because you're like, oh, we're friends. Like, I wouldn't tell my friend to not do X, Y, or Z, because that's not my place to tell a friend that, you know. But you're not a friend, you're a parent, so it is your place to tell them you can't do X, Y, or Z.
That's actually another thing that I wanted to talk to you about too today, because it's the idea that like I was having this conversation with another person a long time ago. It was actually your former roommate, and I was like, what's like your responsibility as a friend? And then I think he answered, your responsibility as a friend is to keep your friends accountable. And for a long, I think I'm still wrestling with what that really means, but I think it means like it's like a died down version of this rule, where it's like, okay, if they do things that like make you actively dislike them, why are they your friends to begin with, you know? And it's like they do things that you fundamentally disagree with. I'm not saying that like, you should just re-engineer or like program your friends to only do things that make you like them. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it's like if you see them making like the same mistakes over and over again to the point where it's like, okay, what else can I do here? Like how can I say no and actually mean it? And there have been several times too in like my life too, where it's been like I see some friends like make the same mistakes or do certain things, and like at a certain point I'm like, okay, like this just can't continue. Like just like I wouldn't be a good friend. Like I'm just enabling you if I were to just stay by you and just say like, oh, everything's okay. Like you do you, man. I absolutely hate that. But at the same time, I don't know how to have that type of conversation, or I don't know where to draw that line in the sense that it's like you value your friendship more than. How would I put that? You value the friend more than you value the friendship, if that makes sense. To the point where you're willing to say like, oh, this, like seeing this happen to you hurts me so bad, to the point where the only way I can get you to understand how wrong this is to like break off the friendship.
Yeah. Or risk breaking off the friendship by confronting you about a situation. I would say, it's what you said, the diet version of this rule. Because I was going to say, I feel like with friends, you draw that line a little bit shorter than you would with your own child. Because, if I'm a parent, I'm not going to let my child drink a Mountain Dew every day. But if my friend's doing that, I might like say something every once in a while, but I'm not going to be super strict. I'm being like, hey, man, you shouldn't drink Mountain Dew. I'm going to realize you're an adult and you can make that decision. If they ask me about it, I'll bring it up. But then, if my friend is binge drinking every weekend, then I might say something, be like, hey man, like what's up with your drinking every weekend? I'm assuming it's not because you don't know about the risk. It's something else is happening, and I want to help you with that, even if I have to have this uncomfortable conversation. Right. Which I think we probably talked about that a little bit in rule 4? Rule 3, where it was like, make friends with those who want what's best for you. So you'd hope that your friends, if you're picking friends who are like trying to push you to be better, that you could also be that to your friends, and hopefully you're making a friendship that's like that is open to at least criticism, or at least you're open enough to criticism. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, for me personally, and that's not to say I'm not guilty of doing the same thing too, because like I know the times where I've just been like, I wouldn't say like being a toxic friend, even though there are times where I have been like just the problematic one in the relationship. But like there are times like when I see like certain friends of mine that they'll just be like, they'll see a bad habit of mine and they'll just be like, oh, that's okay. And like deep down I'm like it's kind of hypocritical too in some ways, because I'm like, dude, grow a spine and tell me like you hate it, But then at the same time, it's like, oh, I'm still doing this shit,
Yeah.
It's like I'm still doing these bad things, but I want you to be able to like, not just be a yes man, or like just enable me to continue the problem, So it's kind of weird, because like how could I possibly bring that up if I'm the person that's like in the wrong objectively? Where I'm the person that's actively undermining my own life. Like who am I to say that, oh, like you should be saying all these things or whatever? I think that's an even like more nefarious problem too. I think that's like outsourcing your responsibility, the responsibility of your life to other people, So it's
which weird. I get. Oh, sorry. No, I was gonna say, which I guess you can go back to rule number 2, and if you think, oh, this is what I want my friend to say to me, so I break this bad habit. Oh, I should just treat myself like I wish I would. Yeah.
Oh wow, damn.
I feel like we're getting a little referential to other rules today. But
I think that's kind of the point of like the rules, and I'm starting to develop a deeper appreciation for how he organized these rules too, because a lot of these are these first rules are more pertinent to like your interpersonal life, and then later on to like the later rules, especially rule 7. I think rule 7 is like do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Like that's sort of
Yeah.
more like when like higher up on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you subscribe to that
Mm,
idea, where it's like the
yeah.
idea of self actualization versus versus like the quality of your interpersonal relationships, you know. So
Yeah.
just the fact that we're able to like cross reference like these rules within each other, I really like it. Really gives me a deeper appreciation for just how he's like structured these rules to begin with, because they make sense now. Well, they make more
Yeah.
sense now, like
Yeah.
in like coexistence rather than in isolation of each other too. And that's kind of the
Yeah.
point of like just writing it as a book to begin with, anyways, rather than just like writing a book dedicated to each rule.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I was thinking, I made a note of this too, where in the book he talks about how, there's a lot, this big kind of theme going on in modern society where we try and change all of society for smaller things too. And I thought, oh, isn't that like the next rule where it's, oh yeah, put your own house in order before you criticize the world, where, he's kind of alluding to that rule where you need to solve your own little problems, decentralized command before you start going up the totem pole to be like, oh, well, I guess there is a bigger issue, you know?
Yeah. Sometimes I
It's,
forget. Sometimes I forget. Not only is he like a what is it? A clinical psychologist, but he's also like he also used to teach at Harvard. You know,
yeah, yeah,
and it's like people don't just get
yeah,
there for like out of the blue. You know, like those people have just tremendous minds sometimes. So another
yeah.
thing I wanted to ask you too is like, do you feel as though this rule like sort of has an expiration date? And what I mean by that is like when your child turns 18 and they sort of become their own fully fledged adult or whatever. Because I mean, at a certain point, it just becomes weird and almost, I guess, almost sort of wrong too for you to hit your kid. Like
Yeah.
say if they're like 25 or like spank them when they're 20. Like it makes no
Yeah,
sense,
yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
if they do something like out of line or whatever, or they, because at that point they're their own adult, right? And they're no longer just your child, you know.
yeah.
Like, what are your
I
thoughts on
think
that?
I wouldn't say it's like a hard expiration date. I think it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, where you kind of slowly ease up on those reins as your child grows up. So like my example earlier, where my parents were like, "Oh, your freshman year of high school, you have to do X, Y, and Z." But then, after the first year, they're like, "Okay, well, you don't have to do specifically X, but you have to do something there. So you can do X, you have to still do, Y and Z, but X can also be elemental P, whatever you want." So I think it's not so much an expiration date as it's like a slow release of the reins where you give them more and more freedom to do
Mm,
something. They still have to do either something or, you know, it's kind of like bedtimes if you want to like a pretty concrete example, or curfew where you slowly increase that curfew because you want to give them a little bit more freedom as they're growing up so that they can do more things, be with their friends more, or, say they get a job or something, or, make exceptions to certain rules as they age so that they get more and more independent as they grow up, so that it is part of that, where he brings up your job as a parent is to socialize your child. So if you do keep them as Sleeping Beauty, protected from the world in a really strict environment, they won't be a productive member of society. So you kind of have to slowly ease back and let them kind of socialize themselves as they age out of your rule, and then always kind of be there, but just less and less in a manner. So, like in college, it's like, oh, I'm here, I can cover your whatever cell phone bill, or help you cover up some bills, or, you know, still some restrictions, but then as you age, it's like, okay, well, now you need to be more financially independent as well, XYZ.
mm. Yeah, I mean, just because we're both still in school right now, I assume that your parents are still like supporting you throughout this whole process, but mine are
Mm,
too, and it's kind of weird in the sense that like they're still they're still supporting me like financially, but they've also given me that level of trust to the point where they know they have an understanding of knowing that like I won't abuse that like sort of privilege they've
yeah.
given me, you know, with like their resources and stuff. And I feel as though like um sometimes I think to myself like, wow, they're really confident in themselves and in me, you know.
Hmm.
And it's like, oh, how
Yeah.
easy would it be for me to just like blow this on all on something stupid, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the same time, it's also like, wow, like I feel as though if I were a parent like that, like it would take so much for me to get to that level with my kids. And I know it's
Yeah.
like one of those gradual tapering things, like you said, where it's like you gradually ease off the brakes into like letting people be their own person.
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe that's just because I'm still young and stupid, and I haven't had a kid of
Hmm.
my own. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, this was an interesting chapter though, just because like a lot of my friends are becoming parents right now too,
Yeah.
and I feel as though like uh, I don't know. I think when I was younger, I always used to like look at like adult people, and I always used to think, oh, like when is it my turn to do all those things, you know? And
Yeah.
I spend so much time asking myself that question, and not spending enough time leading up to it, preparing myself to the point where I'm able to answer that question, you know. Um, so it's kind of weird because I see a lot of my friends like going off and living their lives and doing their thing, and it's also another one of those things too where people only post certain aspects of their life on social media, so there's only so much that I'm aware of too. But it's like in some ways they've become their own parents too in a way, you know. It's not saying that I'm
Yeah.
not, but it's also like they've sort of like stepped into like this whole new identity. I used to think it was so cheesy when people are talking about like the like I'm opening a new chapter of my life. I'm like, get real, man.
Mm.
You're going to college. You know, it's not
Yeah.
it's not too much different. But like this is like one of those things where I'm like, wow, like they're really like stepping into their own, and they're in charge of little people now. You know.
Yeah. I guess I was gonna ask, what do you think, taking this back to like applying it to your own life now or like outside of parenting? I was trying to think like what does like rewarding behavior look like? Because I feel like I don't want to infantilize my friends or like my coworkers, but I also want to try and integrate this reward and punishment schema
I've actually,
into
yeah,
like
yeah. That's
friendships and work.
mm,
Like I don't want to sound like I'm coddling or like I said
right.
infantilizing, being like, "Oh, good job, Janet. You got the spreadsheet done on time. Here's a candy." Like, you know.
Truth be told, like as crazy as I'm not saying you should like just be handing out candies and stuff, you know,
Mm,
but something that I've really come to understand. Well, I've always had a hard time understanding it, just because like when you're a kid, like you hardly ever think that your words carry any meaning or value, you know. But like the older I get, whenever I tell someone, "Hey, I appreciate you," like, and it comes from like a
mm,
genuine place, like their eyes just light up, you know,
yeah.
and like their body language like changes before my eyes to the point where I'm just like, I never knew my words carried that sort of power, you know,
Yeah.
and it's like I feel as though because we've gone through so much, people that just hit like maybe like the mid to late part of their I'm not saying we've seen all of like what life has to offer, right? But at a certain point you sort of are able to smell bullshit when you see it, and but also you're able to like almost parse out what is like a genuine thing, you know. So something that I've noticed too is like not only is it important to like show like actions always speak louder than words, but it's also the idea that it doesn't render the power of your words to zero, right? So like
Mm,
whenever you say like, oh hey, you helped me with this job, like maybe you helped me out on this project, and you really helped me, you saved my ass and you helped me meet a deadline, I really appreciate that. And then you like
yeah.
just feel like a warmth in like your chest, and you're like, wow, that feels really good. Or even better yet, like you give them like a hug or something, or you buy them a gift or something, and just be like, oh hey, like I saw this, like I think I've done this with you, where it's like I saw this and then I thought of you, so I just bought it and I want you to have it, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
it's like just those random like tokens of appreciation. I think that's what it comes down to. It's not like, oh yes, I must offer like positive. It's like gonna be a Pavlovian response where it's like, oh they do this for me, I'm gonna give them a treat or whatever. Um, that's not Pavlovian. Sorry, that's Skinner,
Yeah.
right? That's condition. That's classical conditioning versus operant conditioning. Yeah, not bad.
Yeah. I think too. I was thinking, rather than it being like a stupid candy, where it's like,
Right.
oh, you get rewarded in actual tangible ways. Where if you have someone who's underneath you, like I don't know, it's hard. I was trying to think of a medical example, but maybe like in a regular business structure where it's like, oh, Janet did such a great job on that spreadsheet. Oh, I'm gonna give her more spreadsheets to do, and then eventually, like, it's like obviously that sounds like a punishment, but it's like, oh, I'm gonna give more trust into Janet, and maybe Janet will be in charge of the next project rather than just doing the spreadsheets,
That,
or
or you promote Janet, you do
yeah, or
something
yeah,
that, like, you give her a raise or something like that. And also
yeah, yeah,
the other thing too with that is also, um, uh, to go back to the idea, I feel like words is the easiest thing to, like, acknowledge, because the value of words is so, like, a it's so, like, immaterial, right? No one's able to
yeah,
put absolute value on words. But it's like the more you say certain things, sometimes the less the less weight it carries and the less value it has, you know. So it's also being careful with the things that you say too, because if you tell someone, oh, I appreciate this, I appreciate that, or whatever, like, and you're just like, I'm not saying it's a bad thing to show appreciation for, like, when people have done you right or whatever, but it's like if you express that too much and too liberally, it becomes a lot easier for people to take for granted, you know. So now suddenly, like,
yeah,
the words or, like, the actions that you've taken to sort of promote the good behavior, or promote your or to express your gratitude, they suddenly lose their value. I'm not saying it's right.
yeah,
I'm not saying that's the way it should be. I mean, I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying it's the way it should be. The way that it
yeah.
is.
Yeah, I was just thinking, yeah, because one of the pools I worked at, we always got pizza at every monthly meeting, whether or not anything good or bad happened. So I'm thinking, oh yeah, if you just like made it so that the pizza or whatever is conditional, which would probably work because at a pool because they're all teenagers or at oldest college students, but something similar to that in the workplace where it's like, oh, I can't just like have a pizza party in the workplace every month. It has to be like conditional.
Yeah. You ever have those end of the year pizza parties in school, like in high school?
Yeah,
But then
yeah.
the pizza's like, it's like cold and it's like a sliver,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
no one gets like the toppings that they want. It's sort of like,
Yeah.
that's like the bastardized version of that,
Yeah.
where it's
We
like,
ordered just cheese and supreme pizza. So you better like everything on your pizza or nothing on your pizza. And
yeah, it's so troll. But, yeah. All right. Do you have anything
so
else to
yeah,
add?
I mean, I don't I think I kind of went through my list
Yeah, I think so too. I
that I
think
made.
I think this is one of those things where this is one of those chapters, especially where it's like, I don't know if you want a family, for your own, like, in the future,
Yeah.
but it's like more. It's like more will be revealed in the future. This will probably be
Yeah,
something
yeah,
that I
yeah.
have to especially have to revisit in, like, 10 years from now,
Yeah.
when I'm in charge of little people. But
Or we'd have to rewrite the entire chapter, what we kind of did, reapplying it to your life, which
yeah,
would be more efficient to just find something else that talked about,
yeah.
you know.
I'm gonna have to set a reminder on YouTube to upload a video of this chapter, uh, a video of this review for the chapter in 10 years from now, and see if we
Oh,
come to
yeah.
the same conclusions. But yeah, I mean, that's it from us, and we'll see you all next week when we're talking about Rule 6. Peace.
Let's see.